violence is self-defeating. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword.
You know, when you construct a man as a great man, there's nothing almost more satisfying than also seeing him as the opposite.
When the National Archive puts government documents up on the web, one has to confront them.
Tapes from the hotel rooms, FBI reports, those are pieces of information that we shouldn't have. The FBI was most alarmed about King because of his success.
He realized how sick this country was. We were trying to reveal the truth about segregation.
J. Edgar Hoover is famous for saying that he feared the rise of a black messiah.
The FBI says it's clear Martin Luther King Jr. is the most dangerous Negro in America, and we have to use every resource at our disposal to destroy him.
The next film we're going to review is MLK FBI, a new film by Sam Pollard, currently on BFI Player. Carys, tell us a little bit about this film.
Yeah, so MLK FBI is an archival documentary about Martin Luther King, and I guess more specifically the way in which the FBI featured in his kind of rise within the civil rights movement. It focuses very much in on how the FBI use surveillance to try control and kind of change the narrative on anything that they perceived as a threat against the state. So I guess if Martin Luther King's the protagonist of the story, then his direct antagonist is J. Edgar Hoover, who served as the Director General for the FBI for, I think it was around 40 years. I think he served under like about 8 presidents. Obviously this is very much around the kind of Lyndon B. Johnson days. Yeah, it sort of plots how that surveillance sort of changed its course depending on what the FBI saw as the weak point in threats against the state. It's pretty classic, I guess, in terms of its format. You know, it uses obviously footage of Martin Luther King's speeches, his public appearances on TV, and it also cleverly weaves in a couple of films from the time about the FBI. You know, it shows us that this is really like what's happening in America at this point. There's the House Un-American Activity Committee set up. Communism's a big threat. Left-wing civil rights movement's a big threat. And these are the main issues kind of facing the more maybe conservative government, Republican, if you will. Well, I mean, what do you guys think of it?
I like this a lot. I think as much as anything else, right? I didn't know any of this really. You know, I mean, the most I know about J. Edgar Hoover is the fact that Leonardo DiCaprio played him in a film, quite frankly. So to watch this is kind of galling, and I think if you don't know about it, that's, you know, kind of the point of it. I like the construction of it as well. I think I quite like the fact that it went through in chronological order. The reason being that, as you say, the way in which this information that the FBI were gathering was to be used against King changes, right? And it kind of gets to the point that they would do anything really, you know, because it starts off with him in his association with Sam Levinson, who I think was involved in communist politics in the States, and it starts off as this kind of analysis of the way America's always had this kind of like bogeyman in communism. You know, it was communism then, it's socialism now, right? But essentially it's anybody who's not really aligned with the political orthodoxy, shall we say. It's not afraid to, without sort of like overtly damning people, maybe with the exception of Hoover, it's not afraid to kind of like get across people's complicity in these activities, right? You know, multiple mentions are made of the fact that the Attorney General for a large stretch of this film's timeline was Bobby Kennedy, and you know, his involvement in the fact that he needed to sign off on a lot of this stuff. Like, it doesn't gloss over that. there's a lot of talk about kind of like Lyndon B. Johnson's role in the civil rights movement, but it also gets across quite how his role and his opinion of Martin Luther King shifts. I find it really compelling, and I think that's really what the point of this documentary is, and it achieves that quite well. If I'm going to play devil's advocate slightly, my only complaint with it is there are a lot of voices in this film, and they generally take the form of voiceover without knowing, and some of them are very obvious, like right at the end of the film, you get a little tiny voiceover from like, James Comey, right? So unless you know who these people are already, I did sometimes find it a little hard to parse what perspective they were coming at it from. Like there's one part where there's several points where I think it's Beverly Gage says, if you look at this from the point of view of the law enforcement agencies, and I take her, like, it's a very valuable point to make, but without knowing kind of how she's approaching this discussion, it does kind of like make you sit up and kind of, me anyway, kind of like, well, where's this going? So if it was up to me, I think I'd maybe want a little bit more about what perspective the narration is coming from a little bit. But overall, in terms of kind of documenting a time in American history and the unfortunate parallels in terms of like even like some of the rhetoric which is demonstrated from people and elected politicians in the film, and how it remains sadly still very relevant, it works on a couple of levels that you would look for in this sort of thing. So I got a lot out of it, and I think that one complaint I've got of it, I don't even know if I'd call it a complaint, is very minor. I think it's a very compelling documentary about something that really I didn't know about at all.
Well, as the token American here who, probably knows a lot about this, I'm actually, and maybe just has watched, I mean, I don't know enough, but I did notice how like Bertha Dockhouse was like promoting it online and saying, learn more information about MLK and FBI. And by watching it, I was like, what, maybe it's just being privy to like lots of documentaries on cable TV where they're, stipulating this kind of behavior by the FBI. This wasn't like new news to me. It wasn't something that I had never, I mean, perhaps the details of it, but something that I wouldn't have imagined or expected. I also, I know who Clarence Jones is because I have some work and a piece I did about his book about speech writing of MLK. So it was really great to hear. And I guess I had a personal interest in that, as well as working with the Riverside Church where Martin Luther King gave that really famous speech. So, the archive of that, and so I guess maybe my understanding of this made me kind of follow the story in that way. I have to say, as a documentary filmmaker who's been doing a lot of stuff with archive, in my head, I was just like, wow, like, how expensive was all that footage? But just how did they get all of that? It was just an incredible amount of, for me, the editing of that, like that archive footage and that kind of just seamlessly going to tell the story with the voiceover worked in a way that, as everyone says, it's not like this new novel thing. I think it's a little bit more on the lines of, Senna and Amy, and, this kind of, that was kind of novel a few years ago when the idea of like, let's not show the interviewers, but we only had 3 or 4 people that were part of that personal story. And in this case, did it work exactly well on who was talking at that time? I don't know, but I thought it worked well with the fact that the footage was really powerful. It also made me, again, I mean, in a time when I think I'm so uneasy about what's going on in the world, watching archive footage of peaceful protests and leaders who, are just are amazing examples. I think it's a really important piece for people to watch. And I think it's really incredibly resonant at this stage for all of the things that have gone on this year, but like just to watch it, I think it was incredibly well done, at least in terms of the editing and the music and the archive component, let alone the massive amount of research. I actually took a screen grab of all of the different archive places that like must have been used. So in that capacity, I really did enjoy it. I think it's an important film to watch. But do I think, I'm not sure it broke bounds in terms of like, we were talking about, new kinds of formats of documentary, certainly didn't maybe do that, but that didn't bother me with meeting Gorbachev either. So I think that was the kind of case we made there. Curious about Marc's thoughts.
Sure. I think it ends up raising lots of interesting questions about King as a person, and part of the documentary's thrust is that there's this cache of tapes that's going to be unveiled and declassified in 2027 that relates to King's extramarital affairs and the information that may or may not be contained within that. And they kind of debate at the end, what will the effect of this be? And they don't answer it, and which is great because they can't. And so part of the documentary is like raising a question to be dealt with at a later date, and I think that's an important thing that documentaries can and should do, instead of just giving, and in the way that people use documentaries at the minute, there's kind of this problem of this is the truth, the absolute truth, nothing but the truth, and we do need to be given lenses in which to question things. And I think that the documentary gives you a lens in which to question those conclusions. I think that's really interesting. Jim's point about the identities of the voiceovers is really important to me, though, because there are clips in the film which speak to the fact that disinformation is not a new thing in the world over, but in America specifically. There are horrifying clips of vox pops involving sort of older white American citizens who say horrific things about Dr. King, because it's in the newspapers, and as the point that Carys talking about, it's in the media too. It's in these FBI movies, which kind of valorize the FBI as an institution instead of seeing it as it is, as a repressive state apparatus. And I think keeping the identities, or at least tells you the names, and so sometimes you can guess what the affiliations are. What this does is it lets the archive drive the film, which I think is, a fine operation, and the way that it's been edited, as Amanda mentioned, it's by Laura Tomaselli as the editor, and it's an amazing job compiling the clips of Dr. King, the interviews, the clips of J. Edgar Hoover. I will complain slightly about the newly shot footage of people looking at tape recorders in FBI offices, which are really just like silly sets. Like, is that really needed? I don't know. But what it does, it doesn't distract you from the, appreciating the, the skillfully assembled montage. I think that's a fine job that's done there. However, what it does do also at the same time is it takes away a certain amount of responsibility from the viewer, because a viewer in a documentary constantly has to weigh the value of truth claims. And because that's slightly been taken away from you, you're not really getting that chance to examine your biases, although it looks as though you are. I don't really think it is. I think it's kind of, it ends up making everything retroactive, so that you get that bit at the end where people reveal their affiliations and you to sort of cast back over the film as you've just saw it. I felt I could see the reasoning behind it. I think it's fine reasoning, but it also does take away a certain amount of responsibility from the viewer, and responsibility in watching a documentary is huge. It's a huge part of watching them, of appreciating them, of talking about them, of thinking about them. I will also say that I love the bit of footage of Dr. King talking about the effects of the civil rights movement for Black Americans. He says that it gives people a somebodyness. And not only a wonderful line, but there's an amazing documentary that I think is around on the web at the minute by Madeline Anderson called I Am Somebody. And I think that links to it specifically. I will say that I think this being framed at times as a personal vendetta on J. Edgar Hoover's part against Dr. King, I think forgoes an opportunity to connect this in a profounder sense with the history of, repression of Black people, repression of anybody who challenges white supremacy in the States. I feel like just the emphasis of that part of the film's direction, I felt like missed, the opportunity to link it to that wider point, which I think one of the historians who's interviewed does. She does a commendable job at the end of the film, at the very end of the film, linking it to that. And I thought that should actually probably be, just in argumentative terms, I thought that should have been a much more thoroughly integrated part in the thrust of the narrative. But it's very commendably put together. As I say, that archive job is enormous, and I think it sutures you into place. You know, we talk about suture in film narrative. Documentaries do this too. And I'm sometimes wary of it because it can too easily, you can get caught in a really nice editing rhythm and the leaps and the joins between things. It can service as propaganda sometimes. It doesn't here, obviously, because there's critical intelligence behind it. But I will say the scariest thing is the thing that's I've just mentioned, which is those clips of people, and the clips of the old woman with the photograph saying this is a photograph of Dr. King at communist training school. It's like, well, is that all the evidence that you have? Yes, and I know it. And it's that like entrenchment of argument, which we see all the time today. And I think the documentary's got a good analysis of that, while at the same time I have some questions about the use of those interviewees. But all in all, I think an impressive archival active assembly.
Carys.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I would add to that, or sort of carry on from that, is that ending of the film, and I guess it does shift its kind of form very suddenly from the archival to these kind of talking head interviews with sort of significant historians and people weighing in on the question of this 2027 file. And I guess in spite of, or as well as everything that I come away from in terms of the historical FBI Martin Luther King kind of struggle aspect of the film, I have found myself more focusing on that question of like what is going to happen even when this file comes out. And I think particularly because of the time that we live in now, of this like cancel culture and of sort of like misinformation on the internet, and you can just see that that narrative, people just kind of running away with it. And I think it's such an issue of, in particular for people who represent, be it minority groups or kind of the sort of like less dominant narrative group in the time, is that one individual has to stand for like everyone. And so Martin Luther King almost wouldn't have been allowed to be a fallible man. Like he had to be this perfect, just Christian civil rights God, but he was a man, and perhaps he did let his kind of temptations get the better of him. But I guess it does sort of scare me that could completely end up rewriting the narrative of who he is in kind of 7 years from now, for example. And I guess that also makes me feel like, I think one of the other things about the film is that I found myself, I guess, kind of wanting more. Like I kind of wanted the next, like another part of like what, be it the FBI is then continuing kind of look into someone else who comes after Martin Luther King. I think probably because we're in the age of documentary series that I'm used to getting like 10 hours on every topic, that this one was definitely one where I was like, yeah, I could do another 5, 6, 7 hours on this same subject matter. But I really enjoyed it, and I think completely to what you guys say about the editing and the amount of content in there, it's very rich. Definitely one you can kind of go back to and pore over again, and pick out even more details.
Yeah, I mean, I see where everyone's coming with the I guess to like I said, I think to me it comes in the way that it was pushed, the way that it's promoted, and the way people are interested in things, and the way people will watch something is having to do with these personalities. So like J. Edgar Hoover being a person, it's that's done really bad things in the FBI, and what they have done, it falls into this like very common, as we all know, like obsession with conspiracies and the grassy knoll and all that, that kind of stuff. So it's that, I think that was driving that thing, but the film to me wasn't about that as much. And I think there was, like you said, I think I liked the fact that there was almost 2 separate narratives going on. One of this conversation between these 5 interviews that were I thought artfully chosen. I mean, you have, someone who was very close to Dr. Martin Luther King, but also someone who was in the FBI, and I didn't know who, and then you could tell there was art, but you could there was that frame that would not have been told through that footage. And then the archive footage, which certainly told a different story, but also told a story that was so important, like now, you know, it's so resonant right now for me. And I thought I personally thought they worked very well together, and enjoyed the end. Just at the end, we brought those questions out, you know, of what's going to happen in the future when these get announced. And I thought, you know, in any case, I really could have liked, you know, I've seen a lot of films that have done worse in terms of taking on such an important topic, and I think it was respectfully and artfully done, for sure.
Just to connect it to a couple of other films too, because Pollard, I think, he was involved, I think he was an editor of the civil rights series Eyes on the Prize, which I think is on YouTube, and that's very long, so that would fulfill Carys's like 10-hour thing. But there's a really great archival documentary called Let the Fire Burn by Jason Osder from a few years ago, which is about the MOVE bombings in 1985 in Philadelphia. And that similarly has just an incredible recreation of the period in amazing, exacting, horrifying, pit of the stomach sort of engulfing detail. And I'd thoroughly recommend that if people are looking for other things to go along with, you know, similarly artfully assembled archive documentaries.
Great. Well, worth checking out, MLK FBI on BFI Player now. So check it out and let us know what you think.